This is day 2 of their first annual. That's right, we just heard they've already locked in dates for next year. So next year we will be back here. We'll get bigger, better, and grow more. So make sure you tell people about it, and we're gonna have a great time. Joining us in the first presentation this morning, Tobias Wayland. And Tobias is a passionate Fortean and outspoken paranormal agnostic who spent the last 9 years actively investigating the unusual. For the first 5 years, he did it as a MUFON field investigator, and the last 4 as a freelance writer, and then the head writer and editor for the Singular Fortean Society. His years as an investigator has served him best by illustrating that when it comes to the anomalous, the preternatural, and the paranormal, any answers he's found are still hopelessly outnumbered by questions, which hopefully you will find as the show presents itself. You start to think you've got the answers. You think you know what's going on in the paranormal, and then we realize it's elusive and it slips through our fingers. But Tobias is here, and many of the speakers are here to try to shed some light on these today, so enjoy yourselves. Turn your phones off or set them to stun, and please welcome to the stage, Tobias Wayland.
Yeah, give it up for Dave. What a pro, right? We're lucky to have him. So, as per my introduction, my name is Tobias Wayland, and myself, along with my beautiful wife and partner Emily down there, represent the Singular Fortean Society. So, let me tell you, actually, before I get started, a little bit about what we do. So, the Singular Fortean Society, a lot of people ask us, what that name means, and the gist of it is Charles Fort, from whom the word Fortean comes, was an early 20th century collector of weird news stories. So he would collect these anomalous stories, what he would call damned data, because it was data that was ostracized by both the mainstream scientific and religious communities at the time. And he would take these stories and he would collect them and he would write about them. He would try to find commonalities. He would try to see what was going on behind them, to sort of peek behind the veil, as it were. And so that's where we get Fortean from. And as far as singular is concerned, I mean, a lot of people know, obviously, the word singular can mean one, but it can also mean unique, and it can mean remarkable. And I like to think that we bring something unique and remarkable as an organization. But much more than that, because this organization isn't just Emily and myself. It's our friends, our colleagues, it's you. It's literally everybody who approaches these subjects with an open mind, who really wants answers. And so everybody involved is unique, is remarkable. Everybody's perspectives are unique and remarkable. And because of that, I couldn't think of a better word than singular to describe this society. A little more specifically about what we do have our website, singularfortean.com. We mostly focus on paranormal journalism, research, investigation, and community outreach. What that community outreach looks like, it can be anything from actively investigating somebody's house if they're having some sort of difficulty. It can be what we have in Art Portal that Emily started, where we can feature different paranormal artists, people who are very, very talented, who are inspired by the same weird stuff that brought all of us here together today. Sometimes it's just being somebody who will listen. Not everybody wants their story published. Not everybody is comfortable with being in the spotlight, and that's okay. Like, I get it. So sometimes it's just being a shoulder to cry on. It's just being somebody willing to listen to somebody and let them know that they're not crazy. So that gives you a little bit of background on us. And so what I want to talk about today is, for the last year and a half or so, we've been investigating sightings of a strange flying humanoid that originated in the Chicago area, and since then reports have spread out further into Illinois, and frankly every state bordering Lake Michigan, which is why I've taken recently to just referring to this as the Lake Michigan Mothman. So if you're not familiar with the original Mothman sightings from where we've taken that name. Back in the 60s in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and I'm just going to give a brief overview here, there were a series of sightings beginning in November of 1966. And this series of sightings featured it was a large black flying creature said to have red glowing eyes. And it was seen by many people in this sleepy town in West Virginia. And these sightings ultimately culminated in the collapse of the Silver Bridge, pretty famously at the time, and very tragically. And that happened in December 15, 1967. And sort of since those events, people have speculated that, you know, perhaps that creature, if it wasn't directly involved, was at least in ominous, you know, representation of things to come. So, for our purposes, though, the sightings that we'll be concentrating on began in mid-April of 2017. So, on April 15th, MUFON received 3 different reports from witnesses who had claimed to see something very unusual in the Chicago area. I'm going to actually go over these in chronological order. I actually don't remember in what order they were reported, but in any case, so 10 p.m. April 15th, a woman says that she was out boating with her friends off of Montrose Beach to celebrate a birthday. And you know, they're having fun on this boat, and she looks up and she sees what she described as a huge bat circling above their boat. She says it circled 3 times and then flew off. And she says she was able to see it, not, you know, super clearly, like she didn't get a lot of detail or anything, but she was able to make out its outline because it was backlit by the moon somewhat, which, according to historical weather data, was waning gibbous at the time. And as far as cloud cover is concerned, it was mostly cloudy, so I could buy that, sure, there's a break in the clouds, the moon comes through, you see this thing. Anyway, she says it circled their boat 3 times and flew off. And about 5 minutes later, off in the distance, they see this inexplicable green light. They're sure it wasn't an airplane or anything else. And she's overcome with fear, and she just insists they leave right away. You know, so they go and get off the water. The next account from that time period was at 10:30 on April 15th, and that one involves a guy who said he was hanging out with some friends of his when they encountered what he described as a Yakuza. So if you're not familiar with the Yakuza, it is in Mexican folklore a witch who is capable of shape-shifting into animals. Most often, they're described as turning into large owls. And so he described how they encountered this thing that looked like a large owl, but it stood up to be 6 foot tall and you know, had glowing red eyes, and it takes off. And in the early morning of April 16th, at about 2 a.m., a man arrived for work at the Chicago International Produce Market to see several of his fellow employees standing in the parking lot, and they're all looking into the sky, pointing at this thing. And so he gets out, and of course he's naturally curious about what they're looking at. And you know, he says he sees this huge owl. He described it as over 6 feet tall, had bright yellowish reddish eyes, and frankly, they threw rocks at it until it flew off, according to this report. Now, one thing I will say about these initial MUFON reports, so I spoke to Sam Moranto a few times regarding these. He's the Illinois State Director for that chapter of the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON. And, you know, he doesn't put an undue amount of credence into these reports. As it's my understanding, he didn't feel as though he was able, or anyone was able, for these specific reports to investigate them in a thorough enough manner for him to really be able to say that there was really something unusual about it, or even that they happened. I know there was difficulty following up with witnesses and things of that nature. So, definitely take those with a grain of salt as far as the veracity of these reports is concerned. But what's important about them, what's most important, is what they began. Because as soon as they were published, they were picked up by different paranormal news outlets. We started writing about them, Phantoms and Monsters started writing about them, and as soon as that happened, other reports started flooding in. And over the course of the next year, we received dozens and dozens. So soon, we're receiving dozens and dozens of reports from Chicago, and eventually they start spreading out into every state surrounding Lake Michigan. And it's interesting because, after all this time looking into these, people will ask me what I think about it all, and it's taken me a long time to sort of sift through all of the data and look through all of the reports, to talk to witnesses, do whatever we can. And at this point, I'm fairly comfortable in saying that I think that what we're dealing with are disparate but concurrent phenomena. That is to say, I think that probably initially, most of the sightings that came out of Chicago were of large birds. But those sightings of large birds and their popularity and how much they were reported on has led to people with truly anomalous experiences, potentially paranormal stories, coming forward. It's the popularity of this flap that has made people comfortable enough to come forward and speak about things that are actually really, really weird. But let's start with the birds. So, the destruction of wetland habitats around Chicago has resulted in a lot more wildlife, specifically for our purposes, herons living in the actual urban Chicago area. For instance, between 2009 and 2016, the number of paired black-crowned night herons exploded from 24 mated pairs in 2009 to 300 in 2016, and that's just in Lincoln Park. So it really shouldn't come as too much of a surprise when in the next spring, in 2017, suddenly you have a lot of people in this area who are reporting strange flying creatures that they haven't seen before. And even if those strange flying creatures were birds, it makes sense because of course they haven't seen them before. They didn't live there in those numbers. Sometimes they would talk about, them having red eyes, maybe being vaguely humanoid in shape. And, well, one thing is most species of heron, certainly the ones you're likely to find in Chicago, have eyes adapted to nighttime. So that is to say, they've got the sort of reflective eyes where if you shine the light on them, they would look like they were glowing. And interestingly enough, the black-crowned night heron's eyes are red, coincidentally, or perhaps not. More interestingly to me, though, are their cousin, the great blue heron. You see, because a black-crowned night heron is only about 2 feet long, and their wingspan is maybe 4 feet. But a great blue heron is 4 feet long, with a wingspan of upwards of 7 feet. That's a big bird, and they are known to live in that area. In fact, there's a thriving population in the Chicago Botanic Garden just north of the city. And so it makes a certain amount of sense to me that if something is pushing herons into the city, that is to say the destruction of their wetland habitat, around the same time these populations are exploding in this urban area, we start seeing a lot more reports of strange flying creatures. There's probably a connection there. But there's one more element, I think, that we need to look at to explain why now, as far as why the flap of large bird sightings began. And that is climate change. So climate change basically means that herons, which are a migratory species, are migrating north sooner and staying north longer. They'll even winter up here if they can find open water that doesn't freeze over. So basically, climate change has affected these birds' migration patterns, and it's something that has helped me sort of make sense of the proliferation of sightings, and even how we can have a few sightings outside of what one would consider the normal season, between spring and fall during their migratory period. And so I do have a few sightings that I'd like to point out before I get to the weird ones that I think show best how we could very easily be dealing with a migratory bird like the heron for a good number of these. So herons prefer wetland habitats, and will most often be found near rivers, which Chicago has plenty of, as does the rest of the Midwest. And so they're, most often they'll be found in close proximity to these rivers, and interestingly enough, many of the sightings are also directly adjacent to rivers and bodies of waters and wetland areas. So in April of 2017, it was April 27th, at around 7:30 p.m., a man and his son were just leaving the Little Calumet River in Chicago after an afternoon of fishing. And as they're leaving, as the man reported, he heard what he described as the sound of train brakes. This harsh screeching sound. And he and his son look overhead, and they see a large black something fly overhead. And he described it as being as big as a full-grown man. He said it had to have had something approaching like a 10-foot wingspan. And then about a week later, just over a week later actually, on May 5th, a man and his son were in Calumet Park, which is next to the Little Calumet River, but this time these guys were out hiking, and they saw something fly overhead, which initially they thought might just be a large goose, but then they got a look at it, and they said, that was no goose. It was too big. But also, they described it as being more humanoid in shape. And so they thought maybe it was about 6 feet in height, and they described seeing it fly overhead and take off into the distance. And the thing in this specific report had about an 8-foot wingspan, I believe. And so what's interesting about these is what they're describing is exactly what I would expect somebody to describe a great blue heron, especially if they hadn't seen one in flight before. Now, you might be wondering, so what do you make of somebody describing a 10-foot wingspan? Well, it's notoriously difficult to estimate the size of any flying object. I mean, you don't have anything for reference. At best, what these people would have been doing would have been guessing. And, frankly, the difference between 7 feet and 10 feet when you're looking at something that you've only seen for several seconds as it flies overhead of you isn't much. So I still think that falls pretty easily within the dimensions of what we're talking about. And so another interesting sighting that sort of falls under this category occurred June 30th of 2017. So it was about 10:30 at night, and a security person who works at the Owl in Chicago was outside smoking. And he said he was completely alone, except for maybe a few people on the street. And he noticed across the street in this empty lot here, So the owl is up here, so he's standing like over here, and he sees across the street in this empty lot what he described as a large bat-like creature flying just above the street lights in this empty lot. You know, he said he thought it looked somewhat humanoid in appearance, and you know, he estimated its length at about 5 to 5.5 feet long. Said it was grayish in color. Interestingly, and we haven't got this in a lot of the reports, but he actually described the head, and he said that the head was maybe human-like, but it was much thinner, and it had a pointed crest that was coming off of the back of it. And so he talked about how it had short legs that were sort of tucked beneath it as it was flying, and he thought the wingspan was about 8 to 10 feet. So again, we're looking at that 8 to 10 foot range. He also said that the wings looked like they could have been bat-shaped, but heavier, like a pterosaur. And so the thing about this sighting, and we'll be able to get a closer look at this later, is that again, people are seeing something that they're not expecting to see, in that, you know, these are relatively new. This is a relatively new phenomenon to the Chicago area, having the number of large migratory birds that they do in this urban environment. And so it certainly wasn't any bird, and I believe this, it certainly wasn't any bird that he'd likely seen before. So I absolutely believe that he saw something that was anomalous, something that he couldn't make sense of at the time. And as far as great blue herons are concerned, interestingly enough, they're often described as essentially looking like, you know, living dinosaurs. When they're flying around, they kind of look like pterodactyls because they're descendants of dinosaurs. So, because I know that people like to see, to believe, and I absolutely understand that, the last potential large bird sighting I want to talk to you about came out of the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago. And so this is an interesting one to me, because what happened was we received this report from a man this past May. It was May 9th, and he was bicycling to work. And as a lot of people do who are avid bicyclists, he had a GoPro camera attached to his helmet. So he's bicycling to work, just recording everything he sees, and as he's biking along, he notices this couple standing on the street corner. It's a man and a woman, and the man is pointing at something in the sky, and the woman is clearly seeing it too, and so he looks up, and he sees what he described at the time as this enormous Batman. Not like the superhero, but, you know, something that's part bat and part man. And so he follows it as best he can, trying to record as much footage as he can on this GoPro camera. And he sends it in. You know, he files his report, and I get to talk to him. And it was at the point that I talked to him that he got a little more descriptive as far as what he had thought he had seen, and so he amended it a little bit to say, hey, maybe it could have been a guy in a wingsuit. I don't know. And so, you know, I got to talking to him, and I asked him if he would just go online, and I didn't tell him to look at any specific kind of bird, but I asked him to just look at pictures of large birds in flight. Just look for some, you know, pictures of large birds freely available online, and tell me if any of them resemble what you saw. And sure enough, he comes back and says, well, the closest one was a great blue heron. And so he sent us that GoPro footage, and we were able to get some decent stills, and we were able to enlarge them. So here's the first still here, and you can see, you know, circled the creature, sort of how he saw it, and then there it is enlarged, and then here's the second one, and there it is enlarged again. And this third one is my favorite because once it's enlarged, I mean, what does that look like to you? Yeah, absolutely, it's a bird. So, as a way of sort of being able to confirm this even further, we had one of the investigators that we were working with, a guy named Vance Nesbitt, actually had an interesting sighting when he was outside of work one day. So this would have been at the end of March of this year, 2018. And so Vance was outside of work. It was around lunchtime, and he works in the airline industry. And so he's outside of work, and he sees something sort of out of the top of his vision. And so he looks up, and it's this enormous bird. And you know, so he takes a second because it was strange, and it sort of caught him off guard. And you know, he looks up at it, and he realizes what he's seeing, and he goes, you know, holy crap, I've got to get a picture of this thing. He runs inside, and he grabs his phone, and he manages to snap those 3 pictures. Which, again, you know, they're clearly birds, but what's interesting too, you know, is when you compare, you know, especially the one in the upper right corner there, whoops, and maybe the one at the bottom, to the final picture from our Pilsen sighting witness, I mean, they're pretty comparable. And so, you know, Vance manages to get those 3 pictures, and when he was talking about it later, you know, as a guy who works in that field, you know, he sort of has a habit of identifying planes, and you know, I would give him the benefit of the doubt as far as being a little more capable than the average, you know, layperson of estimating size of something he sees in the air. And so he had actually estimated that this thing probably had about a 7 to 8 foot wingspan. And he actually described it as being very dark in color as well. You know, he was thinking about it, of course, and he had ruled out several species of birds. He didn't think it could be a sandhill crane for a few reasons. Sandhill cranes, although they were migrating at this time, usually aren't seen alone. And also, when cranes fly, they fly with their necks extended, and I mean, there's clearly no extended neck or head on those birds. And so, you know, he was able to rule out that it was too big to be an eagle or a vulture or anything like that. But the one thing it could be, and he came just shy of saying this, although I'm comfortable in saying it, the one thing it could be, to my mind, is, you know, our friend, the great blue heron. So, you can see, there's the black-crowned night heron, and then there's a great blue heron. And so you can see, when they fly, what they do is they retract their neck back. So while they normally on the ground will have these big long necks, you know, when they're flying, they tuck them back. So when, you know, I would receive these reports or see these reports from people who are describing, you know, maybe something that they thought was bat-like or even owl-like with a vaguely humanoid shape, well, if that thing had its head tucked back, and you just saw it very quickly with the silhouette we saw before, with those skinny legs sticking out from behind it, and you had no idea what you were seeing, I might describe it as a bat-like, vaguely humanoid-shaped monster, frankly. So, there was a sighting that came out of the Little Village in 2017. It was late September. And a mother and her son were at home, and they heard their neighbor's dog barking ferociously. Like, the dog was going nuts about something. And so, since the neighbor's dog was in their backyard, they decided that they would go, you know, look at their own backyard and try to figure out what this dog was barking at. So they go and they flip on their back porch light, and in the light of that bulb, they see this sketch. Now this sketch was actually drawn by the witness's girlfriend via his description, and sent in to Lon Strickler over at Phantoms and Monsters. And the experience described was one of terror. So the mother collapsed almost immediately in fright, just fell to the floor. And the son, watched this thing for just a little bit longer. He said it stuck around for maybe 10 seconds, and then it took off up into the sky. And so he gave some dimensions to it. Said it was against the backdrop of their garage. So unlike when you're seeing something flying around in the sky, when you have something on the ground in relation to something else that you can describe it against, I think you can get a little bit more accurate of an estimate, frankly. And so he had said that he thought this thing was between 6 and 7 feet tall, and maybe had a 15-foot wingspan. So again, there's going to be some variance, I'm sure, between that and the actual reality. But again, he at least had something to compare it to. And this was an interesting one because Emily and I actually went out and got to talk to this guy and sort of see exactly where everything happened. It took place in Mukwonago, Wisconsin. So if anybody's familiar with the Milwaukee area, this is just outside of that. It's a tiny little town. It's a fairly rural area, especially. Well, I mean, we're all probably fairly familiar with Wisconsin and how quickly Wisconsin becomes rural outside of any city. So I mean, that's Mukwonago. And so this guy had his sighting in mid-April of 2017. I believe it was April 14th. And what he described was, he was heading home, and he was talking to his friend on his cell phone, and he lived with his parents. So when he gets home, it's late at night, and he decides, hey, instead of continuing this conversation inside and maybe waking my parents up, I'm just going to finish talking to my buddy outside, and then I'll go in. And so, in front of his van, which he had parked facing the street, there was a lamppost about 50 feet away. And the lamppost was on because it was nighttime. And as he's talking to his friend, he notices that silhouetted against the ambient light from this lamppost, there's a person, what he thought at first could have been a person, standing in front of his van. So he, very bravely, in my opinion, turns his headlights on to get a better look at this. And what he sees wasn't a person. He saw, according to his description, something roughly 7 feet tall with dark, scaly skin. And the reason he said he knew the skin was scaly was because it had been misting out all day. And so there was still some moisture in the air, and he said that he saw the light reflecting off of the moisture on this thing's skin. And that's how close it was. It was maybe 5 to 10 feet away from the van. But he saw the light reflecting off of the moisture of this thing's skin, and that's how he could tell, sort of it had that slick, almost reptilian sort of look to it. And so he says it's standing there, and it's got these huge wings, and it has its wings wrapped around itself. And so if you can picture a bat hanging upside down, so how they sort of have their wings wrapped around themselves, like my excellent example just now, only standing up. That's how it was standing there in front of him. And he said it didn't have, any glowing red eyes or anything like that. It had these huge black eyes, and they stared at him, and he said they looked right through him, and he had this overwhelming, ominous feeling, this stark terror, this feeling of dread, which you'll see is actually pretty common amongst the sightings that I think have the best chance of being something truly paranormal. And as he's seeing this thing, he's describing it all to his friend, who willingly corroborates his story later, and at least from his end of it. And so at first his friend thinks he's joking, of course, but it soon, it soon enough becomes apparent that he's not. And by the time he's done describing this thing to his friend, we're talking seconds, 10 or 15 seconds. It's gone. It disappears in this blur of motion. He described it as looking at this thing and then seeing it sort of blur, and then it's gone, as though it had moved so quickly that his eye couldn't track it. And so it's gone, and at that point, he decides that it's probably safer to go inside than to continue sitting in the van. And a couple weeks later, his friend with whom he was speaking on the phone, he comes to him and he says, "Hey, I don't know if you've seen this in the news or not, but you should check out these Chicago sightings." And thankfully he did, and sometime later when he got the courage up, he reached out and he reported his sighting. And so there's his van, and you can sort of see how rural the area is. There's me. And so I'm 6'2", and I was standing, 6 to 8 feet in front of the van there, and about the spot that he had estimated that this thing was standing. And so compared to me, at 6'2", this thing's head was closer to the top of the windshield there, which is also the top of the photograph. So if I'm over 6 feet, and that thing's closer to the top of that windshield, I don't know why I'm pointing instead of using this, and that thing's closer to the top of this windshield, it's pretty tall. So here you can see sort of from the van where the lamppost would have been in coordination with its position. And then that's just the view from the north. So the way the van was facing, that's what's directly across the street. And so there's a connection here. And I like I said before, I really think that connection is that misidentified large birds have led other people to come forward about actually mysterious sightings that bear a strange resemblance to the Mothman of Point Pleasant. So just another couple of quick examples about how this has all come together. So there were 2 sightings in 2017 at the end of May, both of which took place in Chicago. One was near Lakeview, and the other was near Ashland Avenue. And the first one was about 7:30 p.m. A woman and her boyfriend saw what they described as a large black flying man with wings near Ashland Ave, and he was flying around without flapping his wings, backlit by the moon, according to their report. And really, more importantly for us here, is they got home after seeing this thing. First thing they did was go to the internet, which is what everybody does now. They went to the internet, they Googled it, and tried to find out, hey, 1, what are we seeing? 2, who can we talk about with it? Or who can we talk about it with? And so this, the second couple who saw something strange the same night did the exact same thing. They were walking home, they were around Lakeview Avenue in Chicago. They saw what they described as a large bat-like creature, so again, sort of a combination of bat and man, which, frankly, as far as these 2 sightings are concerned, I think we're probably dealing with misidentified large birds. But for our purposes, that's not particularly important. But again, what is important is they see this thing, they go home, they Google it, they find these other sightings, and they find out where to report it, which is the magic of the internet. Honestly, without the internet, I really don't think we get the reports we've got. I don't think we get these weird reports because people don't like to come forward anymore. People don't like to be in the spotlight, at least not in my experience. And so, these initial sightings gave gave up these internet search returns. You know, so when people would Google large bat creature or flying humanoid Chicago or whatever, they'd be led to Phantoms and Monsters or UFO Clearinghouse or us at the Singular Fortean Society. And that's how they would report their sighting, and that's why not only have the majority of sightings come to us, mostly through the magic of search engine optimization, but it's how they were reported to anybody. It's why they were reported in the first place, frankly. And so one of the things I find most fascinating about this is the fact that it's led to some really strange historical reports, things that have happened in the past. Because of the popularity of this flap and how widespread it's been and how many people have seen it, we've got people coming forward who, saw, well, in one case, saw something 30 years ago, who are finally comfortable enough to come forward and talk about it, who have found a place where they can report their sighting, where, they thought, nothing like that existed. Maybe they were the only one who had seen it, who knows? So I've got a couple here that I like to talk about. So this one from 1987 was reported to us by a gentleman who lives actually outside of Oakland City, Indiana. And he lives out in the country, and one of the things he likes to do recreationally is he takes an evening walk. And so back in 1987, he's on his evening walk, and before anything weird happens to him, he feels this overwhelming sense of dread, just out of nowhere, just from 0 to terrified. And so, he thinks, considering the circumstances of being terrified, maybe he's just going to jog home instead of walk. And as he's jogging home, he sees this thing, this large flying thing, overtake him in the air. It flies over him, and he sees these bright, glowing red eyes. And as he described to me then, throughout the years ever since, he said easily a dozen times, sometimes when he's out on these evening walks, he'll see these glowing red eyes. They'll be off in the distance, and every time he says he's sure it's got to be that same thing, and every time he has the same anomalous sense of terror. So it's difficult to know what to make of that, other than the fact that it matches the terror that we've seen reported in essentially every other sighting that we've received that I consider truly anomalous and not simply a misidentified large migratory bird. Now, these Rockford sightings actually are fairly interesting in and of themselves, I think. And so we actually received 2 reports, very, very similar reports actually out of Rockford. And they both came from sets of teenage boys who, in the summer of 2010, were doing what teenage boys who live in small towns or relatively small cities or whatever do. It's what I did when I was a kid. You cruise around in the country. You don't have anything else to do. You're 16. You've got a car, so you go cruise. And I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to just sort of give you the similarities between these sightings and talk about them instead of going as in-depth, but if you're interested, talk to me after this and I'll get as in-depth as you want. So basically what both of these sets of boys described was they would be out cruising, they found themselves in an area that was a gravel road, and they had slowed the car down. In the first report, it was because they had seen a dip in the road ahead. In the second report, it's because they were trying to drift. So this kid had a 1997 Firebird, and they were slowing down on this gravel road, and then speeding up, and trying to get the car to go sideways. So, I mean, that's weirdly authentic to me, because I have no problem picturing myself doing that at 17. And so, in each case, at some point when they had slowed down, they saw something in the high cornfields that surround these country roads in rural Illinois. They saw something that looked like it was moving through the corn. And they couldn't see it in the high corn, but like most reasonable people would do, I think, the first thing they thought of was, that's probably a deer. So they slowed down almost to a crawl, basically to let these deer, you know, come out of the cornfields and go on their way, because nobody wants to hit a deer. But no deer actually came out of those cornfields. Instead, what they both described using, you know, a little different language was this strange something. So they described this dark black creature with skin like shiny tar. And what does that remind you of? Because I think that guy in Mukwonago might have seen something similar. So they described this dark black creature with shiny tar-like skin, and it sort of bounds out in the road in front of them. It spreads these huge wings, and it flies away. And of course they're overcome with terror, and they take off. And so after they've calmed down a bit, that's when they, you know, when they get to talking amongst themselves to try to figure out more about what they saw. And that's when some of the details come out about, like, the shiny tar-like skin, the fact that it was completely black, and the number of limbs it had. And I think this is an interesting detail. So in both of these reported sightings, both sets of teens, who of course they're in their 20s now, but at the time were teens, described something with 6 limbs. And so we're talking about something with 2 wings, 2 arms, and 2 legs. And they all clearly saw these 6 limbs. And so that's something that's been pretty rare. It's something that's unheard of in any of the cases where, you know, I think it's probably something like a great blue heron. And that makes these particularly interesting to me. And so, ultimately, you know, I get one question a lot. I don't even know for certain that what I believe to be misidentified birds are actually herons. I just think that there is a preponderance of circumstantial evidence pointing to that conclusion. As for the weird sightings, I don't know. I am loath to try to explain one mystery using another. And so, you know, I'm willing to say that it could be almost anything. You know, I won't say that they're aliens or interdimensional beings or cryptids, but I will admit they could be any of those, or none of them. I don't know. It could be something even weirder. Frankly, you know, I'd like to hear your opinion about it. So, if anybody, you know, has any stories or any reports, or you just like paranormal news, feature articles, things like that, I do encourage you to visit us at singularfortean.com. Otherwise, at this point, you know, I'd like to open it up to some questions if anybody has, you know, anything that they're wondering about from the presentation.